The stories. Why the paramedic returned to that turnout. In early March of 2017, a state trooper found a decommissioned ambulance parked just off a mountain turnout east of Ridge County. The vehicle was empty, its back doors wide open, with one boot and a stethoscope left on the asphalt. It was later confirmed the items belonged to a paramedic named Mark Renner, who had driven that same route almost exactly 1 year earlier. What drew him back to the same turnout became the center of one of the strangest internal reviews in the county's emergency services history. Mark was 39, a quiet man who'd spent nearly 2 decades in the field. He'd seen wrecks, fires, and overdoses, the kind of scenes that hollowed out most people within a few years, but he stayed steady. Colleagues said he was professional, unshakable. The only story that ever seemed to trouble him was an accident from late February of 2016. A head-on collision on Route 92 involving a young couple and their infant daughter. The child had survived for 23 minutes in his care before the helicopter arrived, but the parents hadn't made it. Mark never forgot her crying. That sound stayed with him long after the shift ended. According to dispatch logs, Mark stopped requesting overnight shifts after that incident. He rotated into training duties for a few months, then back to field work once he was cleared by department counseling. Nothing seemed off until that following March, when he quietly signed up for the same overnight route, the same mountain stretch, and never came home. Investigators later reconstructed his movements from station cameras and gas receipts. He'd clocked in at 7:04 p.m., stopped for coffee at a roadside diner around 8:30, and drove north up the highway before pulling into the turnout just after 9:10. The dash cam on his unit, recovered from the ambulance, recorded 19 minutes of footage before cutting out. It showed a still landscape, empty road, light snow, and Mark stepping out of the cab, walking toward the guardrail, then disappearing into the dark. There was no struggle, no second figure, no sound beyond the wind. The first assumption was suicide. But the ground search found no trace. No footprints beyond a few feet from the guardrail, no sign of a fall down the ravine. The terrain was steep but not lethal, and cadaver dogs found nothing. When heavy rains swept through 2 days later, investigators halted the search. The county logged it as a presumed drowning, though the river below was shallow and slow-moving that time of year. Nearly 6 months passed before anything new surfaced. In August, a hiker found a sealed envelope wedged beneath a loose plank at a forest overlook, about 3 miles from the turnout. Inside was a folded piece of paper in a waterproof bag, written in uneven block letters. "I came back because I heard her." The note was signed M.R. and dated the same night Mark vanished. At first, analysts dismissed it as a hoax, maybe something left by someone who'd followed the case in the news. But when the lab examined the paper, they confirmed partial fingerprints matching Mark's employment file. The note's ink also matched a brand of pen issued in ambulance restock kits that year. For a while, speculation spread quietly through the department. Some said Mark had been unstable, still haunted by the loss of the infant. Others insisted he'd been fine. Then an old colleague, a retired dispatcher named Ruth Canning, came forward with something she'd kept an archived radio call from the night of his disappearance. She hadn't turned it in earlier because she thought it was just static bleed from another channel, but she'd kept the recording out of habit. When the file was cleaned and enhanced, it revealed something strange. A faint secondary voice overlaying Mark's transmission. He'd called in a routine report. "Unit 307, clear, returning to station." But beneath his words was another voice, faint and distorted, repeating a single phrase, "Still here." Audio experts couldn't fully isolate the sound. It could have been cross-channel interference, a bleed from another frequency, or an artifact from faulty wiring. Still, that clip reignited interest in the case. When investigators compared the timestamps, they realized the radio call had been made exactly 1 minute before the dashcam cut out. Following the renewed attention, a new team reviewed Mark's digital trail. On his department-issued tablet, recovered from the front seat, the last accessed file wasn't a dispatch log. It was a photo stored in a personal folder labeled Training Refs. The image, according to metadata, had been taken 1 year earlier on the night of the crash. It showed the infant's car seat illuminated by the ambulance's interior light with a small knitted blanket tucked inside. Nothing seemed unusual until they enhanced the reflection on the rear window. A faint outline of Mark turned toward the seat, mouth open as if speaking. The lead investigator, Lieutenant Harris, later told a local paper that what struck him most wasn't the evidence, but the timing. Every major event in Mark's final weeks corresponded with the accident's anniversary, the same dates, the same hours, even the same shift requests. It was as if he'd been tracing the exact pattern of that night. The county eventually filed its final report as undetermined circumstances. The official narrative suggested exhaustion, stress, and possible exposure contributing to disorientation and accidental injury. Yet, off the record, several responders admitted unease. One firefighter recalled hearing a distant sound of crying during the initial search, echoing faintly through the ravine, though no infant was ever found. In 2018, the turnout was repaved and renamed, and most people moved on. But every year, around late February, local radio operators report short bursts of static on the old EMS frequency. They last only seconds and usually coincide with wind gusts off the ridge. Nothing verifiable ever transmits through. Today, a small marker stands at that turnout, a simple white post with no inscription. Truckers still pull over there to check their brakes before the steep descent. Some say if you stop long enough, the silence feels heavier than it should, as if the air itself remembers something unresolved. No one ever proved what happened to Mark Renner. Theories range from a fall to voluntary disappearance, even to mistaken identity. What remains certain is that he returned there by choice. The note, the radio call, the anniversary, all pointed toward a man circling back to a moment he couldn't let go of. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. A paramedic haunted by one unfinished call, a turnout carved into the mountainside, and an unanswered question that time refused to bury. The rest is silence, the kind that fills the air between sirens, waiting for someone to break it again. The stories. Paramedic who kept the final snapshot from triage. The last photo on Kira Voss's work phone was never supposed to survive the software pilot. It stayed anyway after the server hiccup. Kira was 34, a city paramedic who liked quiet late calls and neat paperwork. She started that Tuesday on basic supply checks and light banter. Her goal sounded simple in her head. Finish a 10-hour shift without a single upgrade, then get home before midnight for leftover curry. The call that changed the night came from a roadside motel behind a car wash. Dispatch logged an unresponsive male, unknown age, possible overdose. She and her partner, Mateo Lark, rolled in with lights low and voices steady. Room 12 smelled like cleaner and stale heat from the wall unit. A thin man lay sideways between the bed and a chair, breathing shallow and quick. No wallet in sight. A cracked phone blinking a silent screen. Kira saw a visitor sticker stuck to his hoodie pocket. The date line was smudged, but the background color looked like a clinic pass. They bagged him for a minute to settle his breathing. A half-full paper cup sat by the sink, ice melted into a flat circle of water. Vital signs were jumpy, but not crashing. He opened his eyes once and said a short word that sounded like Riley. Then he slipped under again. They moved fast to the medical center near the river. The radio reported a separate pileup north, which meant triage would be crowded and loud. The hospital had been piloting an electronic intake tool all month. It asked for a quick face photo to match a barcode before the wristband print. The intake line was 3 deep when they arrived. A nurse pushed the cart forward, the printer chattered, everyone talked clipped and fast on instinct. Kira snapped the photo at the kiosk because the app flashed a warning. Upload pending, network unstable. She kept his hoodie on because he shook. The man landed in a monitored bay by the doors. A resident named Bryn Ketter called for labs and a gentle drip. The resident squinted at the chart. Kira wrote her run sheet near the sink. She noted the visitor sticker and the motel room number, and she logged the time from the wall clock. Security cut a small plastic bag from the man's waist string. The bag held a folded laundromat card, a bent key, $3, and a receipt. A second surge of ambulances flooded triage with crash patients. Yellow tags and green tags pressed into the hallway. Voices layered into a dense cloud. In the noise, someone swapped beds to clear space. The man with the hoodie slid one bay over, and a crash patient took his place under a portable lamp. Kira and Mateo finished their handoff after an hour. The man seemed stable. They cleaned the stretcher rails, signed the tablet, and walked toward the exit. The code alarm sounded from the bay they had left. Kira swiveled in the doorway and saw movement through bodies. Someone called for epinephrine with a clipped tone. She stood still without getting in the way. The team pushed and counted and charted. The monitor flattened once, then kicked back, then flatlined again while staff switched roles. Kira did not like leaving after a loss. She did what protocol allows. She tapped Mateo's arm, then they cleared the doorway and stepped into the humid night. Back at the station, reports stacked up behind them. An hour later, an internal message flagged her run. The patient from the motel did not make it. The summary blamed an unknown allergy aggravated by a blood pressure medication. It suggested the crew had no information at scene and that intake documentation was incomplete. Kira read that line twice. She remembered scratching on his left palm, faint letters smudged by sweat and cleaner. She also remembered the sticker on the hoodie pocket. She opened her notes app and zoomed on a quick photo of the motel nightstand. A corner of the visitor sticker showed a logo like a lighthouse beacon. Her phone buzzed again with a request from quality assurance. Please confirm the scene contained no allergy indications. Please confirm no wallet or tags were found. Kira typed careful answers. She wrote that the scene had no formal bracelet, but there was writing on skin and a clinic sticker with a dateline. She could hear Mateo in the next room telling a joke about stale granola bars. She closed her eyes, pictured the kiosk light, and remembered the app freeze. She opened the work app and saw the pending icon. The photo from triage had sat in the queue since that busy hour. It should have deleted itself. She saved a copy to the secure folder because the pilots sometimes ate evidence. Officers who handle accident scenes had warned crews to keep their own digital trail. In the photo, the man stared past the kiosk, eyes unfocused, mouth clenched. The shot was crisp enough to read small print on the edge of his hoodie. She leaned toward the phone and read the visitor sticker again. The shape matched a clinic 2 miles north. The color matched last week's series on their site. She noticed something else that bothered her. The wristband in the photo was already on his right wrist, and the printed name was not Riley or unknown. The name read Colin Hart with a birth year that was wrong by 2 decades. The band also carried a room assignment for a different wing upstairs. Kira checked the run sheet and confirmed the time on the photo. It was taken before he left intake, with a clock in the frame above the desk. She balanced possibilities in her head. Either the band printer reused a label by accident, or triage grabbed a band intended for someone from the crash. She called the station supervisor and spoke in a flat voice. She also saved the app log and the photo metadata. She wanted a clean chain if asked. The supervisor told her to hold steady. He said quality would reach out by morning and that she should write her memory within the next hour. Kira wrote about the motel room, the visitor sticker, the palm writing, and the switch between bays during the crash surge. She avoided guesses and listed times. By sunrise, the hospital asked to speak with her. A comm coordinator named Lauren Pike scheduled a meeting in a small office near the loading dock. Lauren listened without interruption while Kira laid out the sequence. He wrote down the kiosk freeze, the wrong name on the band, and the sticker details. "Do you have the photo?" he asked plainly. Kira nodded once and slid her phone forward. Loren studied the image like a puzzle that did not want solving. He asked for permission to copy the file into their incident folder. Kira agreed and asked for a printed receipt of transfer. Lauren printed one with a timestamp. Later that day, security pulled camera clips around intake and the hallway. Audio is thin in those clips, but timestamps line up with dispatch logs from that hour. A volunteer recalled bumping the band cart while pushing crash supplies. The cart carried 2 stacks from different printers. A stack fell and another stack landed on top. A nurse remembered seeing a resident hand off a half-printed band to clear paper jams. Everyone meant well, and the hallway demanded corners get rounded to save seconds. The wrong band landed on the wrong wrist during the shuffle. The allergy field below the name read none, and the medication plan followed that value at speed. The palm writing found in the photo said lisinopril with a shaky loop on the L. That writing matched a pharmacy warning card found later in the discarded bag. The path to his name was still unsolved. The wrong band had masked his identity, and the motel room registry carried a fake first name paid in cash. Kira and Mateo stopped by the motel between calls and spoke to the clerk. The clerk remembered the man because he had asked for late checkout and offered a 10. The clerk described a quiet talker with a careful way of folding receipts. He said the man asked if the clinic across the highway took walk-ins on Sundays. Kira asked if he had left anything behind. The clerk pulled a small envelope from under the counter and handed it over. Inside was a second laundromat card. The card carried the same punched pattern as the one from his bag. A faded stamp showed a cartoon lighthouse that matched the clinic logo from the sticker. Kira wrote the clinic name into her notes and searched internal contacts for a social worker who knew someone there. Network rules can sometimes solve what computers cannot. By evening, a social worker faxed a staff list with a first name that matched the word Riley from the ambulance. A receptionist there recalled a cousin who visited often. The cousin lived near the rail tracks and had shared rides with a man named Rail Hinton. That name pulled a match from the clinic immunization folder with a phone number. The number reached a sister on the third ring. She had been calling hospitals all day without luck. She cried once, then steadied, and asked for straight answers. Kira gave the sister the number for Loren and the case coordinator. She explained that the hospital would confirm identity through records, and that she would share what she could. The sister described Rael as a careful man who wrote allergy reminders on his hand while saving for new glasses. She said he kept every receipt because he lost a wallet once. She also said he used visitor stickers as bookmarks. He picked them from clinic bowls like candy, because ink on paper made him feel less small. The hospital identified him formally by evening, using clinic records and a dental chart from an old file. The visitor sticker linked the timeline to a specific morning. The report shifted. Instead of blaming a vague, unknown allergy, the document focused on a band cart process and a printer override protocol during surge conditions. Quality assurance asked to keep Kira's photo, which showed the wrong band before bedside orders fired. Her pending upload had turned into an anchor for the timeline. Loren thanked her in a quiet hallway near the vending machines. He said the photo mattered because it caught a small truth at the exact right second. He also said the hospital planned a training session with a new rule. Wristbands would be applied only after a complete scan and a spoken name confirmation. Kira asked about the visitor sticker and the laundromat card. Loren said the family had seen those items and that they were grateful for the detail and care. There was a final meeting about the phrase kept photo, because the tool policy warned against storing faces. Loren documented the server failure and the pending icon. He wrote that the photo had been preserved to support timely reporting during a pilot outage. He signed the form with a date and left a copy in her file. Mateo teased her gently about her habit of triple-saving things. He said she was a walking archive with a neat ponytail and an allergic reaction to loose ends. She laughed, then stood quiet for a breath. She thought about the palm writing and how small a warning can look when a hallway feels crowded. Weeks later, a new kiosk arrived with better network checks. The printer trays carried bold labels, and volunteers learned to stop and verify whenever carts bumped. Kira kept a printed run sheet from that night in her desk. The sheet had her small notes about the lighthouse sticker and the ice in the cup. An instructor asked her to teach one class for new hires. She told them about the photo and the band, and the way tiny signals can vanish under noise. A student asked how she remembered so much. She said she wrote on index cards, and she made little recordings after calls while the radio was still warm. The sister sent a letter with a simple line. "Thank you for noticing the sticker." It made the phone call shorter, and it made the goodbye kinder. Kira folded the letter into the run sheet and closed the drawer. She washed her coffee cup, then walked outside to breathe the late shift air. The city sounded like a distant fan that needed oil. She wondered how many small warnings slide past each night because nobody has a free hand to catch them. She knew the photo would fade into policy and training slides. She also knew that a single clear frame can hold a hallway steady when clocks feel slippery. On quiet nights, she drives past the motel on her way home. The neon still flickers, and the car wash still hums across the frozen curb. She thinks about the visitor sticker and the lighthouse logo. She thinks about the wrong name on a band and the right name in a folder miles away. She is not someone who keeps trophies from hard calls. She kept that one photo long enough to send it to the right folder with a receipt. The fact that it stayed during a glitch felt like the kind of accident that refuses to be ignored. It asked for someone to slow down. Her work is not a string of heroic saves. It is a long practice of noticing small, true things before they slip beneath a wave of noise. The photo taught her something she already knew. Details are not decorations, and time is never a blur when someone chooses to write things down. The story ends without fireworks because that is how most true stories end. A hallway returns to normal, and a system gets a little less clumsy. Kira drives home with the window cracked and a song on low volume. She knows nothing can make the loss tidy, but clarity still matters. She unlocks her door, drops her bag, and checks her phone for one last message. The queue is empty, and the app finally reads, "Upload complete." She smiles once without any triumph, then she turns off the light and lets the day settle while the city hums and the clock keeps moving. The stories. Night guard who logged footsteps, no camera recorded. The night it happened, the security office at the old Westmore shipping depot smelled like dust and burnt coffee. According to shift logs, a 42-year-old guard named Dennis Halbrook clocked in at 11:30 p.m. and wrote a short note. Asterisk. Routine patrol. Clear floor. Humid tonight. Asterisk. He was the only guard on duty. By dawn, his chair was empty, his flashlight was lying under the main stairwell, and the building's cameras, 8 of them, showed nothing from the hours between midnight and 2. Westmore had been a Rust Belt landmark since the late 1970s, a concrete maze of loading bays and silent conveyor belts on the edge of a quiet Midwestern town. Dennis had worked there for 7 years, divorced, reliable, usually quiet. The kind of man who showed up early and read old paperbacks during breaks. That night was supposed to be uneventful, just a standard walkthrough before the building was scheduled for renovation. Around 12:10, he logged a line in the duty notebook kept beside the monitor screens. Asterisk. Footsteps on mezzanine catwalk, West Wing. Checked cams, no feed, asterisk. A minute later, asterisk. Still hearing it, will inspect, asterisk. That was the last thing he ever wrote. The plant's internal system backed up video every 6 hours. When investigators reviewed the footage from the mezzanine camera, the feed cut to static precisely at 12:08. Other cameras kept recording fine until 2:30, showing only flickering lights and empty halls. A maintenance worker named Harold Cortez arrived early that morning to replace fluorescent tubes on the ground level. He found Dennis's flashlight lying on its side, beam still weakly glowing, and the notebook open. No sign of struggle, no torn fabric, no blood. Just footprints, 2 sets tracked faintly through the dust. One set from Dennis's standard issue boots, the other, smaller, bare, leading to the freight elevator that hadn't worked in months. The county sheriff's department filed the case as a missing person. Official notes cited malfunctioning surveillance and probable equipment interference. But people who'd worked there doubted the malfunction explanation. Westmore's night tech, a woman named Carla Wynn, swore she'd serviced those cameras the previous week. They were old, but fine, she told local reporters. The cables were intact. You can't lose a feed that clean unless someone cuts power at the board. Dennis's sister, a nurse named Ruth, said he'd called her the night before. He'd sounded distracted, mentioning he'd found a second badge lying by the locker room door. She assumed he meant another guard's ID, but the company only issued one active credential, his. Archived building logs later showed the same badge used twice that night, once when Dennis clocked in, again at 12:11, opening the West Wing stairwell door. Whoever used it the second time moved toward the mezzanine exactly where Dennis had gone to investigate. By late summer of 2014, the company shut down the depot and cleared out the interior. Cleanup crews unearthed a small personal cassette recorder near a ventilation shaft behind the third bay. It contained about 30 seconds of audio, the hum of lights, a pair of quick footsteps, a metallic clank, then Dennis's voice saying, "Who's up there?" followed by a short distortion burst and silence. Audio engineers confirmed the tape had been magnetically warped, likely by exposure to a strong field, not heat or age. There was another strange detail buried in the sheriff's supplementary report, a mention of radio interference in patrol channels between 12 and 12:30. The on-call dispatcher logged fragments of words bleeding through static asterisk. Northgate, lights out, he's still here. Asterisk, none of the other guards were on duty that night, and the next scheduled patrol wasn't until morning. Years later, a local journalist named Owen Ralston revisited the case for a regional history program. He interviewed former employees and found that in 1998, 2 decades earlier, another guard, 39-year-old Gerald Pike, had disappeared during overnight maintenance. Same mezzanine, same missing camera footage, same unexplained power surge. Back then, the report blamed faulty wiring. Ralston tracked down Gerald's surviving son, who showed him an old Polaroid his father had taken before the disappearance. The photo captured the West Wing catwalk at night, lights flickering in the distance. In the lower right corner, partially blurred, was a faint silhouette that seemed to be looking down at whoever held the camera. Analysts couldn't verify whether it was a reflection or a person. But when the journalist compared the layout of that image with modern floor plans, he noticed something: the angle matched exactly where Dennis's flashlight was later found. What made it worse, the timestamp written in blue ink on the Polaroid's border, asterisk, the 3rd of April 1998, 12:11 M asterisk, was identical to the digital record of Dennis's badge swipe, asterisk 12:11 M asterisk, 2 men, 16 years apart, logged in the same minute of the hour, in the same corridor, just before both vanished. Electrical engineers consulted during Ralston's project suggested a pattern of ground faults that might have caused rolling blackouts localized to one wing, possibly scrambling old analog video circuits. It could explain the synchronized failures, but they couldn't explain how both guards' ID logs and physical traces pointed to motion beyond any camera's field. In late autumn of 2021, the depot site was finally demolished. Before the demolition, a volunteer archivist named Leah Torres cataloged remaining items from the security office for the county museum. Inside a rusted filing cabinet, she found the original duty notebook sealed in a plastic evidence bag. Most pages were smudged, but the last line stood clear under the dried ink. Asterisk. Still hearing it. Will inspect. Asterisk. Beneath it, barely visible under a tilt of light, another faint line appeared, impressed by pen pressure, not ink. Forensic enhancement later revealed, asterisk, recording this time. Asterisk. That phrase matched an unfiled cassette found near Dennis's locker years earlier, the same type used for the warped tape. The archivist played it carefully on a restored deck. The audio was faint, but at the 13-second mark came what experts described as a pattern of steps, counted 7, then stop. The acoustics placed it roughly 10 feet above the ground, consistent with the mezzanine. When news of the find resurfaced, Ralston added an epilogue to his documentary. He pointed out that both the 1998 and 2014 incidents shared one quiet constant. The security logs always mentioned footsteps, but never the echo that should have followed in a steel-floored building. He speculated that the mezzanine's partial collapse during construction years earlier created a space that resonated oddly, bending sound in ways the old analog recorders couldn't track. Maybe, he said in the closing narration, what Dennis heard wasn't someone walking, but the building replaying itself. The official record lists Dennis Halbrook as missing, presumed deceased. No remains were ever found. The West Wing mezzanine was melted down with the rest of the metal. Today, the old depot grounds are a parking lot for long-haul trucks. Drivers who park overnight sometimes mention hearing boots pacing above the asphalt when the wind picks up, though there's nothing there, just open sky. Local radio traffic still gets random interference near mile marker 32, short bursts that resemble a steady rhythm of footsteps. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. 2 guards, years apart, logged the same minute, heard the same sound, and left no image behind. The rest, whatever it was, stayed between the missing frames of a camera that never recorded and a notebook line that never should have been there. The stories. A final call was traced near that bridge. Late in the evening of October 5th, 2016, a storm rolled through a quiet stretch of countryside. Wind battered the old bridge over Hollow Creek, shaking the steel rails and scattering leaves across the asphalt. Around 10:32 p.m., dispatch logs show a brief, incomplete 911 call pinged off the nearest tower. The caller's voice was male, panicked, and cut off mid-sentence. Investigators later marked the audio as simply unresolved. The man behind that call was named Leon Price, 43, a long-haul truck mechanic from a nearby industrial town. He'd spent the day finishing a repair job for a delivery company, planning to drive home to his wife in time to watch a recorded game. According to coworkers, Leon left the shop around 9:40, saying he wanted to check something quick before heading home. That something was never explained. By morning, Leon's truck was found parked near the old bridge, headlights off, and driver's door locked. His phone sat on the passenger seat, the last number dialed being emergency services. The call duration? 12 seconds. No sign of a struggle. Just the smell of damp metal and mud, and a faint drag mark leading toward the railing. Search teams spent 3 days combing the area. Divers worked the shallow creek, drones scanned the woods. Nothing. Local papers speculated everything from suicide to abduction, but investigators leaned toward an accident. Maybe he'd slipped trying to inspect something under the bridge. Yet the coroner never received a body, and the case sat open as missing, presumed dead. His Nuber mens inspix. Years later, in 2021, a city engineer named Rachel Kearns was reviewing archived bridge inspection photos for a maintenance report. In one image, taken 2 days before Leon's disappearance, a reflection caught her attention. The photo showed the lower truss beam standard shot, but in the corner, faintly lit by a maintenance flashlight, there was a silhouette of a man crouching. The timestamp placed it around dusk on October 3rd, 2 days before Leon vanished. The engineer who'd taken the photo, retired since, confirmed no one else was scheduled to be on site. Rachel forwarded the image to the county sheriff's office, and they reopened the file. Investigators re-examined Leon's work records, tracing his calls and texts from that week. One stood out. A message to a contact labeled BR sent the afternoon of October 5th. It read, asterisk, I found it, meeting at the bridge tonight. Asterisk, the number was prepaid, never registered, and disconnected within 48 hours. A detail in the message puzzled detectives. Leon wasn't known for secrecy. His wife, Dana, told them he'd been bothered for months by something from an old job, saying he'd done work he wasn't proud of for a client that refused to pay. Dana assumed it was a parts dispute, but when she mentioned a box Leon kept locked in his garage, the investigation shifted. Inside the box, police found a spiral notebook filled with maintenance records dating back to 2009, all logged under a defunct company name, Midstate Transport. Midstate had folded after a fatal trucking accident that same year, a crash investigators blamed on faulty brake lines. In a note scrawled at the back of Leon's notebook, he'd written, asterisk, proof they used counterfeit parts. Need photo evidence. Asterisk. The handwriting grew shaky near the end, as if written in haste. Detectives contacted the National Highway Safety Archive, which confirmed that a whistleblower had anonymously submitted similar claims in 2009, alleging that Midstate falsified inspection reports. The case was dropped for lack of evidence. The archived whistleblower email was traced back to a generic account created under the name LP. That bridge where Leon's final call was traced? It connected 2 counties where Midstate operated their delivery routes. According to old GPS logs, the crash that ended the company happened less than a mile from the same spot. Investigators brought in a retired dispatcher, Marvin Blake, who'd worked the radio the night of Leon's disappearance. He remembered something odd. Just after the 911 call ended, the system registered another incoming line static, then silence. It was like someone else tried calling from the same tower seconds later, he said. but the system flagged it as unregistered equipment, like a test signal. The telecom technician reviewing archive data found that the second call's source ID matched an obsolete analog handset, one last sold around 2010. Its signal strength placed it not on the bridge, but 30 yards downstream, near a maintenance access path. Detectives returned to the site. Flood levels had receded since 2016, revealing a rusted toolbox half buried in silt beneath the bridge. Inside were several brake components, a corroded camera memory card, and a name tag, price L. The photos recovered from the card showed close-ups of serial numbers on parts stamped with counterfeit manufacturer codes, exact matches to those listed in the old Midstate case file. Forensic analysts reconstructed the final minutes of Leon's life through phone tower data and ambient audio from the recovered memory card. The recording suggested he'd been documenting the parts, likely intending to turn them in as evidence. Rain intensified, wind roared, and a loud metallic creak echoed the sound consistent with a vehicle crossing the bridge above him. Seconds later came a splash and muffled crash. The last image on the card showed Leon's flashlight beam turned toward the creek bank, and in the background, a dark SUV partially visible through the guardrails. Authorities attempted to trace any vehicles on that bridge during the window of time. Traffic cameras from the nearby highway ramp were down that night due to the storm, but one motion-activated wildlife camera a mile away captured taillights heading east around 10:35. The model matched an SUV owned by a former Midstate executive, Brent Rowan. When questioned, Rowan denied being anywhere near the area, stating he'd sold that vehicle years prior. Records later showed the SUV's title transfer occurred 2 months after Leon's disappearance. With no physical remains and no eyewitnesses, the district attorney declined prosecution. The case was again marked unresolved. Still, among investigators, the consensus hardened that Leon Price had gone back to finish what he'd started years earlier to expose falsified safety records that cost lives. He'd arranged to meet someone that night, someone who realized too late what evidence he carried. In early 2022, bridge maintenance crews discovered a piece of phone casing embedded in the concrete ledge beneath the guardrail. Lab tests confirmed it matched Leon's model and contained trace data from his final call. The last GPS ping aligned within 3 feet of where the toolbox was found. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. A man burdened by guilt tried to make something right. He gathered proof of wrongdoing, arranged a meeting, and never came back. The evidence he left behind, notes, photos, the final call, spoke louder than any statement could. Dana Price still visits the site once a year. Locals say she leaves a small brass key on the railing. Investigators believe it's the key from Leon's garage lockbox, the one he'd used to hide the notebook that reopened everything. The bridge stands quiet now, repaved and monitored by new cameras. Every so often, a maintenance crew reports interference on their radios when crossing after dark. A faint echo that clips mid-word 12 seconds long, always the same. Officially, the file reads, "Case closed, pending further evidence." Unofficially, among those who worked it, the belief endures that Leon Price's final call wasn't a cry for help, but a handover. A man trying, in his last breath, to trace the truth back to where it first broke. The stories. This dispatcher flagged a warning nobody else heard. In the summer of 2015, a small county dispatch center in the Midwest logged what should have been another quiet night routine calls, minor accidents, nothing serious. But at 2:36 a.m., dispatcher Lorna Keats flagged a single line in the call log with a red warning tag. The rest of the shift didn't notice. 12 hours later, a missing person report came in from the same road. Lorna was 52, a mother of 3, and one of the few veteran dispatchers still working nights. She'd spent more than 20 years listening to the county breathe through static. Drunk drivers, runaway teens, distant gunshots that usually turned out to be fireworks. That night, she was scheduled to train a new hire, Evan Rhodes, a quiet 20-something fresh out of community college. He remembered her as calm, methodical someone who double-checked even the quiet calls. The call in question lasted just 19 seconds. It came from an unregistered prepaid cell phone traced to the stretch of County Route 47 between mile markers 19 and 20. The caller didn't say much, just a breathy male voice repeating, "He's still here," before the line cut. Background noise, steady hum, maybe an engine, maybe wind. Lorna replayed the audio 3 times, then filed it under possible domestic disturbance. But something made her stop the recording and reopen it. According to her later statement, she heard a faint ticking sound under the voice mechanical, uneven. Like a turn signal that never clicked off, she said. At 2:38, she added a note, "Warning possible vehicle hazard, County 47. No one responded. The patrol car assigned to that region had already been rerouted to a stranded motorist 15 miles away. The shift ended at 6, and by the next day, the flag was buried beneath dozens of other overnight notes. 2 days later, a farmer found a truck half submerged in a drainage ditch along the same stretch of road. Inside was 30-year-old Bradley Norum, a construction worker from a nearby town. Engine still idling, phone missing, seatbelt unlatched. Coroner placed the time of death around 2:40 that same morning, within minutes of Lorna's flagged call. County investigators wrote it up as a single-vehicle accident. They said Bradley likely swerved to avoid a deer, hit the embankment, and drowned before he could escape. Lorna, however, couldn't let it go. She'd handled too many wrecks to ignore the timing. The ticking sound, the phrase, "he's still here," the untraceable number, it didn't add up. A week later, she retrieved the audio from archive storage and took it home on a thumb drive. Her husband found her replaying it that evening, headphones pressed tight, not speaking for almost an hour. She said she thought she heard 2 different voices, one layered under the main one. A whisper, or maybe a radio echo, she told him. He dismissed it as interference, but Lorna wasn't satisfied. She called the phone company listed in the report, Westridge Cellular, to ask about prepaid tower logs. The representative told her the call had pinged off a repeater near Old Mill Road, 2 miles east of the crash. Problem was, that tower had been offline for maintenance between midnight and 3 a.m. She double-checked through county records. The outage was confirmed. If that was true, the call shouldn't have connected at all. When she brought this to her supervisor, he told her it wasn't her concern. "The system hiccups sometimes," he said. "Let it go." Instead, she filed a quiet memo through the internal server detailing her findings and sent a copy to a friend in the State Highway Patrol. The friend, Officer Miriam Cole, kept the note, but admitted later she didn't think much of it until months afterward. Then, in November of that year, a storm knocked out power across the same district. During the outage, technicians discovered a repeater box still running from an auxiliary generator, a model decommissioned years earlier. Inside it was a burned SIM card fused into the port. Serial number partially visible. It matched the first digits of the untraceable phone from Lorna's warning. This detail never made the official report. A small internal inquiry followed, but concluded there was no functional link between the repeater malfunction and any known incident. By that point, Lorna had already transferred to a day shift. She told coworkers she didn't want to hear the night anymore. Years later, a regional journalist researching abandoned communication systems stumbled on the archived memo. The journalist, Alan Marin, interviewed Lorna at her kitchen table in 2020. By then, she'd retired and moved to a smaller town near the river. In the recording, which he later shared for a local podcast, she said something quietly that caught his attention. "You know what gets me?" he said. "He's still here." Not, "I'm still here." Someone else was supposed to hear it. Alan followed the breadcrumb trail dispatch logs, weather reports, the crash file, and that malfunctioning repeater. He found that the generator inside had been serviced twice after its supposed decommission date, each time by a subcontractor called Northspan Utilities. Northspan had folded in 2013, 2 years before the incident. Whoever maintained that repeater after the shutdown wasn't listed in county records. Alan managed to contact one former Northspan technician, a man named Dennis Harlow. Dennis said that in the early 2000s, some repeaters were used to piggyback maintenance frequencies for nearby rail lines. It was a cheap way to test emergency signals, he said. but it was never supposed to overlap with civilian channels. If it did, you'd get bleed through, like ghost calls. Ghost calls. That term caught traction online when Allen's podcast aired, though Lorna hated it. She said the word ghost turned it into superstition, not signal bleed, not malfunction. Still, she admitted the possibility haunted her. The crash site, the voice, the timestamp, they lined up too neatly. In 2021, the county repaved Route 47, covering the drainage ditch. The wreckage was long removed, but for maintenance training, new dispatchers were still shown the red-flagged log from that night as a case study in procedural diligence. The warning nobody else heard became a quiet legend among the staff, half cautionary tale, half proof of how easily small details slip away. What remained were fragments. The 19-second clip archived under a generic file name, the memo Lorna wrote, the service invoices from Northspan, and the coroner's note listing water in the lungs. Each on its own could mean nothing. Together, they formed a pattern too odd to ignore but too thin to prove. Lorna passed away in 2023. At her retirement gathering the year before, a few old colleagues brought up the story. She just smiled and said, "It was probably static." Then, according to Evan, her trainee from that night, she added quietly, "But static comes from somewhere." At this point, the facts that remained were simple. One call, one warning, one man dead on a dark county road. The system logged everything perfectly except for the truth behind that 19-second window. Whether it was interference, a misrouted test frequency, or something else, no one could ever show exactly who made that call or why it stopped where it did. Still, in the dispatch training manual filed a few years later, there's a footnote beside Lorna's case study. It reads, "Always listen twice before you clear a line." No capital letters, no bold text, just quiet advice embedded between procedural codes. A reminder that sometimes the sound we dismiss as noise might be the only signal that matters. The Bridge Collapse Files of Red River County. Locals in Clarksville still point toward the slow bend of the Red River and mention a span that failed without warning. They talk about a sound like lumber snapping across a barnyard and a brown cloud that rolled off the water. Some say the river went quiet for a full minute. Others insist the current rushed harder against the pilings. The event sits between printed pages and tired memories, where dates blur and names drift across coffee counters. Investigators never confirmed a single narrative, and the surviving paperwork reads like a map with two north arrows. The first name that appears across the county file from 2009 is Thomas Avery, 52, consulting civil engineer, in town to review seasonal scour near the east abutment. He arrived from Texarkana on a rented pickup, carried a folding stadia rod, and booked a room at a roadside motor court. His notes, reportedly scanned and misplaced twice, show pencil sketches with neat arrows along gravel approaches. He wrote that spring runoff had undercut a clay shelf and that riprap placement lagged a full year. He planned a second pass at lower water with a contractor present and a county foreman on site. Dispatch logs from the same period reference Maria Kent, 41, paramedic with Red River EMS, sent toward the span after a motorist report about drifting planks. Her unit rolled north on farm-to-market roads with steady radio checks and a quiet engine whine. The log timestamps conflict with her own written addendum, which places her arrival 8 minutes before the first deputy. She noted empty guardrails and a harder breeze from the west that pushed dust into the shallows. She stayed at the south approach and waited for a crew to secure a lane with cones and a chain. A third figure threads through state records and later summaries: Caleb Ross, 29, county road crew foreman, scheduled to meet Avery for a survey walk. He reportedly left the yard early with a steel tape, a faded vest, and a thermos dented along one side. The daybook from his shop lists a fuel top off at 6, a load of rock at 7, and a plan to check the far pier before lunch. Some locals claimed Ross stopped at a grocery for ice and never returned to the truck. Others stated he reached the bridge and waved toward the river. The record of his exact route remains unsettled, and the receipt pile is thinner than expected. Archive notes say the span was a modest truss with timber decking and 3 concrete piers set in an easy channel. The far bank rose into cottonwoods, and the near bank held a graded turnout where anglers backed trailers down a slab. Maintenance logs speak of patched planks and a cracked bearing plate that had been shimmed on a wet afternoon. The repair order shows a red pencil remark that reads, "Still serviceable under single lane only." No one signed a final clearance, and the renewal request died in a stack under a broken stapler. When the structure failed, the sequence becomes a field of magnets pulling in different directions that never quite align. One witness claimed the center deck dropped first and sent a chalky burst downstream. Another insisted the south approach slumped after a truck braked near the crown. A rancher reported hearing 2 distinct impacts with river echoes that sounded like a hallway door. A retired teacher described one long groan as if the river dragged a wet rope across iron. The statements share details but resist consensus, and each page announces certainty with careful handwriting. Avery's pocket notebook surfaced in a banker's box long after the final insurance letter closed. The pages record a sounding taken with a weighted line that read 14 near the mid-channel and 9 closer to the leaning pier. He wrote that drift loads had increased after a storm in early spring and that the upstream pile showed fresh scars. There is a sketch of a void under the clay lip where minnows flick through pale water. He underlined a sentence about scour mitigation with quarry stone and a call to confirm availability within 2 weeks. Kent filed her final report with a tone that suggests fixed habits and a tired office chair. She lists scene hazards that include rebar ends, loose decking, and silt clouds that limit visibility under the truss. She notes a single pickup at the turnout with no occupants and an open toolbox on the tailgate. She records a radio check to County Fire and a request for mutual aid from a neighboring district. Her remarks end with a line about river traffic and 2 anglers who declined to provide names due to a pending tournament. Ross appears next in a terse memo that cites secondhand remarks and a phone call that reached voicemail twice. The memo claims he had walked the south bank with Avery a week earlier and marked 3 soft pockets with orange paint. It suggests he planned to return with fabric and stone once the river fell below the chalk line on the pier. The last certain fact is a signed receipt for gloves and a set of safety glasses at a hardware counter near the square. Every later detail arrives from someone who heard something in a cafe and tucked it between lunch notes. State records list 2 inspections spread across 5 years, with photographs that show a lean toward the east and a hairline crack along a bearing seat. The earlier inspection recommended a load posting that never appeared on either approach. The later inspection assigned a priority that competed with 3 other spans and a culvert collapse on a farm road. A funding note mentions a grant request that stalled after a change in office staff. The document trail grows faint as winter budgets pressed into spring potholes. Mechanical analysis came from a district engineer who used calm sentences and short clauses built for public meetings. He identifies repeated wetting and drying cycles along the timber deck that forced nails to creep. He points toward undermined clay and a narrowed channel that bent current lines against the mid-pier. He writes that a failure origin cannot be fixed with absolute precision due to scoured evidence and missing deck pieces. He asks for a dewatering plan and a crane that never materialized. The county file from 2009 includes photographs with date stamps that do not match the captions typed below. One frame shows a sagging guardrail with rust blooms and a waterline printed like a belt across concrete. Another shows tire marks that end at a splintered edge and a hat resting on a plank. A third shows an empty river surface patterned by wind from the west and a line of bubbles near the far pier. The chain of custody sheet lists a deputy who transferred out and a clerk who retired without an exit interview. Reporters drew maps on legal pads and drove the approaches with a cautious speed of someone reading old pavement for hints. Their articles stitched interviews with shop owners and 2 fishermen who claimed the river changed color after the first impact. One piece quoted a former inspector who said budget cycles have their own weather and you dress for whatever arrives. Another quoted a county commissioner who insisted the span stood within normal service metrics. The printed narratives offered resolve, while the river ignored the words and moved on. Avery left town within a week, recorded by a receipt for fuel and a breakfast ticket punched with a dull hole. He returned once in late summer to present a slide deck with cross-sections and equation lines that bored the room. He recommended stone placement and new bearings cut for the southern seat. He suggested a temporary Bailey to restore a single lane with strict limits. The minutes reflect nods without motion and a closing remark about waiting for cooler weather. Kent rotated off the ambulance for a quarter and took dispatch shifts under bright fluorescent light that flattened the hours. She handled calls about livestock on roads and a boy with a broken wrist and an older man short of breath. When the bridge comes up, her voice stays neutral while her hands move over paper with careful steadiness. She writes that the river remains a hazard zone and that signage needs nightly checks. She never claims more than the logs can support, and her addenda end with standard phrasing. Ross's path fades, where the road leaves town and crosses open fields toward the old ferry traces. Some locals claimed he was seen near the cottonwoods with a level rod, others placed him at a diner booth that never matched the receipt times. A cousin remembered a story about hauling stone past sunset while the radio caught distant stations. A former coworker insisted Ross called about fabric rolls and left a voicemail that never saved. The file keeps his name, but not his last location, and the river keeps its distance from closure. By winter, the approaches were fenced with mesh, and the signs leaned under north wind that smelled like iron. A temporary span sat in the planning folder and moved between committees like a slow truck. The budget hearings pressed on with pipe repairs and a school roof that leaked onto maps. The river dropped into pale seams across sandbars, and the water showed twisted metal like ribs. People drove around the detour and learned new turns that soon felt old. In spring, a work crew staged rock on the south bank and built a ramp with compacted fill and a simple slope. They moved stone against the lean of the current and watched the water change sound as voids filled. They left gaps where the divers wanted clear space and marked a lane with tall posts. A man with a clipboard checked quantities while a crane idled near the turnout. Nothing in the record names him, and no photograph shows his face. Years later, the road pulls straight toward a replacement span that rides higher over a more disciplined channel. The guardrails shine against early sun, and the deck hums under light traffic that stays within the posted signs. Downstream, the old pilings sit in shallow water like molars under a tired gum line. People fish near the shade and glance toward the bank where the gravel turnout still holds a hard edge. The current moves past their boots and says nothing that a recorder can keep. The file ends without a conclusive sentence, and the county clerk wrote, "Closed for now," along the final margin. The failure sits among numbers and measured lines and voices that hold equal conviction. The river holds its own private archive and never shares the index with the courthouse. The names remain in lists that wait for some future reader to try another alignment. Paper can repeat a story, yet the sound that began the story does not return. The snowplow incident on Dalton Highway. In early winter of 2019, a road crew based near Coldfoot reported a missing operator after an overnight maintenance run north. Drivers said the weather thinned for an hour near Otagon Pass, then returned with sharp spindrift across the grade. The report reached a small dispatch room where radio traffic had stayed busy with chain controls and stalled rigs. The first message named a man who left mile marker notes, then failed to clear his scheduled checkpoint on the north slope. The operator was Mark Reyes, 44, a contract plow driver from Fairbanks assigned to the Slope District for the season. He ran a late shift that began after dusk with fuel topped and a spare V-belt strapped under the seat. His purpose was straightforward since the company had a fixed route that required timed passes across exposed sections. Witnesses remembered his voice on the radio sounding even, with short replies that kept to mile numbers and cold readings. Dispatch logs from that night list a start north of Coldfoot at 1900 hours, with guidance to hold before Otagon if winds rose. Archived notes in the district binder describe patch ice near the summit and reports of light snow sliding off the cut banks. A tanker convoy reportedly waited near Dietrich River since heavy gusts had pushed 2 tractor-trailers into the berm earlier. The shift sheet shows Dana Willis, 39, a dispatcher based in Fairbanks, who stayed on the channel while supervisors rotated. State records show Reyes had 12 winters on heavy equipment, with no citations and a completed safety course during 2011. He'd worked pipeline access roads, he'd pulled a grader for a private quarry, and he'd logged clear plow counts on previous runs. His intent that night was to punch through 3 choke points, then meet a mechanic near Galbraith Lake for a salt spreader swap. The mechanic was Evan Tuttle, 52, a seasonal hire whose task was to transfer gear and check hydraulic temperatures before midnight. Some locals claimed a whiteout dropped into the pass fast enough to erase taillights and mute engine sound, yet truckers never agreed. One driver said strobing snow gave the illusion of hills moving sideways across the road while the wheels stayed straight. Another said the wind was loud, but gaps kept opening, and distant beacons appeared steady along the grade for several minutes. Investigators never confirmed a single window of clear weather, since recordings captured only static bursts and clipped phrases around the summit. At 2100, Reyes checked in at a pullout south of the pass, with coolant temperature stable and front blade pressure within range. He mentioned one brief shudder through the chassis that felt like a rut, then silence followed until a short click cut the frequency. Willis radioed back twice with location requests and received nothing, then pinged a nearby rig to scan the shoulder with high beams. The rig driver said he saw drifting grooves that could have been old tracks since fresh snow filled them within seconds. A tracker unit on the plow reportedly sent 3 location bursts clustered near a curve marked by a steep drop to the creek. Technicians said the pings bounced off a repeater and came through delayed, so the timing stamps failed to match the voice log. Search teams moved in after midnight from both sides, and a grader led with chains laced tight across 2 tires. Snow fell in sheets that flattened depth and made shallow cuts look like pits, which slowed the lead truck to walking speed. They reached the curve at first light and found a blade mark that ended clean beside a low drift with no metal exposed. A second pass scraped the shoulder and revealed a hard ridge with chunks of ice wedged above a narrow gouge that fell away. Rope teams moved over the edge and found short slide debris on a bench, then a broken marker flag snagged against brush. No frame parts surfaced during those hours, and the creek ran under plates of ice that shifted with a faint grinding sound. County file from 2009 includes a similar incident where a grader vanished for 2 days before surfacing downstream near a bend. That case resolved when thaw lowered the berm and exposed a mirror that caught sun from a brief break in cloud. The comparison circulated among crew members who kept working the shoulder, yet the terrain here was different with steeper runoff cuts. Records conflict on how quickly the water can rise under drifted ice after strong wind, and the team deferred to the field lead. By late morning, a fuel tender from Deadhorse reached the site and set up heaters near a staging point above the drop. Tuttle arrived from the north with tools and asked for the last radio phrase, then checked the hydraulic lines of a parked plow. He noted a tendency for the quick couplers to chatter during crosswind, which could sound like harsh rattle over the cab floor. Mechanics later wrote that cab noise might mask a failing sensor, since cold snap could trigger alarms that barely breached the static. Aerial support from a contractor circled the pass after wind eased, and the observer described a faint brown scar cutting the slope. The scar blended with ripples left by earlier slides, and a few dark smudges along the line looked like willows pressed flat. Photographs show no bright paint or reflective decal, though one frame catches a straight groove pointing toward a tight creek bend. Investigators never confirmed those features as relevant, since snow squalls smeared edges between frames and made distances hard to judge. Afternoon brought a partial clearing that revealed a fan of ice shards downstream, and a thin sheen of coolant floated in a pool. Samples were jarred for testing, and the chain crew shifted downhill with bars to pry plates loose where the creek narrowed. A snapped radio whip surfaced near a root ball and looked fresh, but the base had no distinct paint and the mount was missing. Some locals claimed scavengers grabbed parts fast after wind events, although crews said nothing moves under that much drifted ice. Willis compiled a timeline that night using dispatch logs and audio clips, then flagged minutes where Reyes last sounded clear and calm. She included notes on tanker releases and 2 reports about a stopped reefer whose engine coughs overlapped the plow check-in. The final packet lists contacts with the State Patrol and a maintenance foreman who drove south to relieve the tired search crew. That foreman added tire print photos that seem to double along the shoulder, which can occur when chains stamp over their own path. During the second day, a Parkerized tow hook appeared in a melt pocket with scratches no wider than a thumbnail along the curve. The hook matched a model used on the plow fleet, yet maintenance inventory showed 6 variations that had circulated for years. Without a serial, technicians wrote a reserved note that placed the hook in a probable category rather than as verified evidence. Some locals claimed the hook drifted from higher on the slope, while others said the creek likely dragged it after a brief surge. On the third day, crews uncovered a ladder rack buried in compact snow beside a narrow stand of willows near the creek. The rack fit, the plow make, and bolt patterns lined up within tolerances, which moved the case toward a likely location. A downstream net caught a small panel stamped with 2 digits that matched the fleet series, though corrosion blurred the final number. Investigators never confirmed whether the panel came from Reyes's machine, and state records marked the find as inconclusive with an asterisk. A trucker who runs that road each week provided a sworn statement that places a bright headlight west of the proper lane. He said the beam cut across a hump of snow and flashed once, then vanished as wind shifted, which he logged against his odometer. Another driver produced a dash recording where only hiss and faint pops can be heard during that minute near the summit pullout. Records conflict on whether either account fits the minute Reyes went quiet, since clock drift and reception gaps complicate the match. A fourth-day probe found the plow nose buried in a kink where the creek dives under a bank and resurfaces in a small pool. Divers worked under ice with lines and spotted a cab corner wedged against a boulder, then a shattered mirror floating free. The recovery took hours as the weather dropped again, and the team cut a trench to guide the frame toward a winch. When the cab cleared, the seatbelt latch showed marks from impact, and the ignition key sat half-turned with the radio switch on. The medical report is brief and cites blunt force trauma with a probable sequence that begins with a sudden drop along the hidden bank. It notes no sign of alcohol and a normal panel, plus bruising that aligns with a violent jolt as the frame struck rock. Investigators never confirmed whether the initial slide began from crosswind push or a shelf collapse that undercut the drift from below. The final line lists cause as accident during storm response, with contributing factors that include limited visibility and shifting ice. In the months after, crews added poles near the curve and new markers above the creek, and radio checks increased before the summit. The company revised night runs and paired plows for that section, while dispatch set tighter windows for convoys during early gust fronts. Some locals claimed the changes came too late and that old warnings about the creek shelf sat ignored in a forgotten drawer. Archived notes show earlier mentions of undercut edges that never reached policy, though supervisors say budget cycles delayed permanent fixes. The Dalton Highway kept running through that winter and the next, and the pass remained a place where visibility turns to noise. State records preserve the photographs and the hook, and the rack sits tagged in a bin that lists the mile number. Drivers still slow near the curve and watch the creek where drifted plates hold for a week, then crack without warning. The file closes with a sentence that keeps to the facts and a road sign that leans slightly north when the wind rises.